Yeah, spot on. And speaking of research, that's also a good segue into this kind of middle part of today's presentation of like, okay, we know that we're supposed to personalize, we understand it's important, but what do we look for? What do we actually like look for, and how do we personalize the email? So there's obviously many ways you can go about researching an account or a prospect or getting information, but really in its simplistic form, it kind of falls into two main categories. You're going to do research about the prospect, who you're reaching out to, and then you're going to do research on the business or the account that they work for, right? To simplify, this is extremely simplified. And so the process that I go through typically is I'll start with the prospect first, and I kind of put together an example of just some things that I look for and where to find them. This is by no means like an all-encompassing list, by the way. But the goal of researching your prospect is to get extremely personalized, to create that pattern interrupt, to get them to read the rest of your email. And so there's a few different topics that you can look for. One would be like their role. So regardless if they have a blank LinkedIn page or not, that's often a question I get is like, well, what do we do if the prospect's LinkedIn page is blank? There's nothing to personalize. You could always personalize based off their role. As a seller, you're supposed to know your prospects' responsibilities, their challenges. There's some kind of low-hanging fruit things you can find on their LinkedIn, like if they were promoted to a new role, maybe they have new responsibilities, maybe it's a work anniversary, maybe they used to work at previous companies or previous roles that would encompass the use case of your product that you're selling. These are just some examples, again, to kind of get their attention. You can find them on their LinkedIn profile or even in your CRM. My favorite thing to do is try to find content, though. Now, this obviously is not always available. Not every prospect makes content, of course. But once you can find that, that's highly going to increase your chances to get a response. And what do I mean by content? I mean content that the prospect has either produced or has been featured on. So whether that could be as simple as a LinkedIn post, a blog, maybe a podcast they're featured on, an interview. And you can find these things on social. You can find podcasts they're featured on with the company with a website called Listen Notes. You can go to the company website, personal website, etc. And the goal here is not to just mention, hey, I saw this podcast you were on, and then go into your pitch. The point is to find something relevant within the podcast, within the content, and that way you can tie your value prop into why you actually are reaching out. And then there's some lazy things that I like to throw in there, like interests. These could be like hobbies, university teams, sports teams, etc. This is not really going to add a lot of relevancy to your email, but it is something, as we mentioned in earlier slides, to maybe use as an icebreaker or throw in the PS at the bottom of the email. Jed, I might pass this one to you. Anything I'm missing here from like the researching the prospects that you like to use?
No, I mean, I think I found this from you, Vin. You made a piece of content on it, the listen notes thing. I would definitely check that out, guys, because that's super cool. You can just like search the person's name and then find podcasts and content they were on. And I've seen other people in terms of like, if you want to pull out some interesting piece of information from a podcast, I can't remember the tools to use it, but there's AI tools you can use to just scan a podcast if you don't want to listen to like a 30-minute podcast and find that relevant. So there's ways to speed this process up. But I think this is spot on. Another thing that I'll also mention in terms of like coming up with new ideas for triggers you can think of or ways to research is like look at your current customers, the meetings that you've booked recently, and then research those companies and what was happening like literally 1 day to 3 months before they came inbound or before you booked that meeting, and try to find like commonalities there. And that's where you'll find a lot of interesting triggers and new ideas for how you can go about creating relevance in your messaging. Is looking at your current customer data, recent booked meetings, and inbound leads. Lots of information to be found there. But aside from that, everything here looks great, man.
Awesome. And Marty, you had mentioned this idea of like above and below the line. So I might actually pass the slide over to you to talk a little bit more about how this impacts the research you do on a prospect.
Yeah, of course. And if you've been in enterprise sales, you're selling to big brands, you know the definition of what it means to be above the line and with the deal and below the line. So as a salesperson, one of the things that you constantly want to remind yourself is, how do I de-risk deals? And what is my fastest line to success? One of the best ways to de-risk a deal is to get aligned at the C-suite. So I labeled here above the line and gave a couple of sub bullets here. When you're above the line, you're truly connected to power. And what I mean by this is you're targeting people that can actually do something. When you're connected with people with power, that ties into their influence in the company. So at the C-suite level, at the VP level, at a bigger company, having influence means they have the ability to go across departments and pull things forward. So usually when you're siloed or below the line down there, you don't have the ability to influence outside of your current department. So what this could look like if you're selling a sales automation tool, maybe you need buy-in from ops, or maybe you need buy-in from IT, maybe a different line, right? So having influence means that you're able to tie into and tap into different departments, because that'll help you accelerate your deal, and then also help multi-thread with the right leaders in each of those departments. Like I said earlier, pain is felt most at the top. And with these tools now, we can find above the line initiatives within minutes. And it's almost inexcusable now as a sales rep to go into a discovery call or to go into an open opportunity and not know what's going on at the accounts. And if it's a small company, that's fine. You could still find maybe some written content from some of the prospects, or the CEO of a startup has definitely put some content out there. Use that to get some power to go above the line. Equip your champion with some notes that say, hey, I know what your company's doing. I've read this release, I've read that, or I've listened to this podcast. And you give them information knowing, hey, I know this is going to be important to people that are making decisions at your company, and you build off of that. So the point of this is we really want to make sure, especially when I'm going out and prospecting, I'm identifying first and foremost who's above the line and below the line at my accounts, because I know if I start targeting people below the line, it could be the best message, it could be the best time, it could be the right information, but ultimately what I'm responsible for is closed revenue. And that's not going to happen if I'm outbounding the people below the line. I can find some information, but I know I need to get myself above this line.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important to understand as you're calling people, as you're reaching out cold, as you get into sales cycles. It's extremely important to know that. I threw in the chat, I proposed a question. I'm curious what departments folks sell into. I see some people selling into sales. I see some people selling into accounting, procurement, actually a few procurement, engineering, finance. These type of roles that I just mentioned earlier, typically the prospects are not that active online. And that's usually, I'm definitely spoiled where I do sell into marketing and sales, and there is a lot of information online about my prospects that I can use in my outreach. But often cases, that's not the same scenario for everyone else. And no matter who the prospect is, you can always personalize based off the account that they work for, or the company they work for, regardless if the prospect is completely ghost online. And so now we go into the account. And again, this is not an encompassing list. This is just some examples of some things that I use when I go ahead and research the account. I start to look for things like the fit, meaning I want to know at the bare minimum, you should know this if you're a salesperson, what industry they're in, what's the size of this company, maybe at some companies like technologies that they use today. You can find all that information on LinkedIn, in your CRM, or even with Chrome extensions like Built With. Now, the other piece of it is like the business aspect of the company. What are some of the industry trends? Again, you can manually research that yourself, or you can leverage AI to help you actually identify some of the key trends within, I'm looking at the chat right now, within, IT or procurement, for example. What are some of the competitors in their space? If you're using a solution that helps you against competitors, that might be worth bringing up. For any publicly traded companies, obviously I don't have to tell you this, but there are money pits within earnings reports, 10Ks, annual reporting. And my favorite thing, honestly, is here in bold, which is simply just going to a company's website, looking for any open roles or headcount changes. If they're hiring for a position that you typically sell to, there is going to be a treasure chest worth of information of their key responsibilities, technologies they leverage, structures of the team, all these type of things that you then can use in your outreach, right? And again, you can find that on LinkedIn, company's website, careers pages, obviously, for the open roles. And then lastly, is your company mentioned in the news? Is it around maybe an M&A? Is it funding? Is it a new product release for the company I work for? Sometimes we look for like rebranding or announcing new products. That's always something that we can help with. So all these things will allow you to, one, build up your business use case for why you're actually reaching out. And then some of these at the bare minimum will just allow you to kind of break that pattern interrupt and use as kind of that icebreaker. I've always found that just going above and beyond with your research always leads to a higher success rate, regardless if your research is a little off, right? You're not going to be an expert on their business. Like my SDR that I work with, I think that's a challenge that he had mentioned is like, well, I don't know exactly if this is the right challenge they're experiencing, but if you just come kind of prepared with your research, let them correct you. So don't kind of hold yourself back in that front.
Yeah, maybe a question
Okay.
from quarantine, like about tools. And one thing I would add is, so this is basically where EvaBot excels. Like EvaBot can do all of this research automatically for you, and we'll show it to you at the end. But in general, we also want to talk about even when you're not using a tool like EvaBot, what you can still do, right? Of course, it's much more hard work, but but you can still do it.
Yeah, spot on. Before we move into kind of the framework of an outbound email, Jed, I might pass it to you. Anything you might want to add to this?
Yeah, well, first off, to Robbie's point as well, if you don't have budget for tools, like a lot of this stuff can be found on LinkedIn and Sales Navigator as well. One thing I would recommend, and like Vin said, this isn't like an extensive list, doesn't have everything in here, but brainstorm all the potential like triggers and research methods you can think of for an account. And then one thing that's helpful for me is that, an M&A or a new product release, thinking about what sort of like problem hypothesis comes up from that, right? So there's a new product release. What does that tell you about potential challenges they might be having? And what I like to do is create a spreadsheet where it's like 3 columns, where it's like first column is all the different research examples. Second column is the potential problem or challenge that might be coming from that. And like Vin said, you're never going to get it 100% right, but you can make assumptions and then ask if those assumptions are correct in your messaging. And then the third column is include like a snippet or a template of how you can just plug that into an email or a LinkedIn message or into your cold call, so that you know exactly what you're saying and what challenge you're talking about whenever you identify one of these triggers or pieces of research. So that kind of like spreadsheet has helped me a lot in my experience. But yeah, that's pretty much it. This is a good example. And I definitely take a screenshot of this if you guys aren't using these already.
Yeah,
that's good. Go
yeah,
ahead,
just
sorry.
one point when I mean, we personally have seen that, doing all of this manually is very, very hard. And one of the surprising things is when we work with some companies that say that, hey, I have never seen any news of this company. I've never seen any of that. But the challenge is that you only saw it once, like you only researched once, right? It's very hard. Like, so suppose you look at a company, you do the research today. Now, for you manually to update that research 2 weeks later is extremely hard, right? You will not do the same thing again, look for the same company's news again. And that is where I believe AI can really help, because it can constantly monitor. And surprisingly enough, like most of these customers that say that I don't find any news on my potential customers, they actually are surprised when they see the results.